So my name is Daniel McClure. I'm a first year faculty. I got my PhD at University of California, Irvine. I research popular media and capitalism, and most of what my talk is going to cover is in a book that should be coming out this fall on UNC Press, University of North Carolina Press. And it's a bit of a bunch of stuff wrapped together like a pretzel, so I needed to script it a little bit more than just do a talk. So hopefully that's tolerable. So the name of it is The Road to Income Inequality, Culture Wars, Conservatism, and the Rise of Neoliberalism. Between the 1960s and 1980s, the U.S. economy shifted from a Keynesian Jim Crow welfare state, or what some might call the American version of social democracy, to an economy modeled on neoliberal and conservative economic ideas. Derived from the 1930s New Deal and mobilization of World War II, the logic of the welfare state served as an economic catalyst aimed toward promoting and securing a prosperous working and middle class America. This, of course, primarily meant white men and their family wage, as women were idealized within American patriarchy as dependent homemakers, and, along with people of color, had yet to achieve legislated social equality in the U.S. This system ran into turbulence in the 1960s, opening a space for the previously discredited ideas of classical liberalism, or laissez-faire economics. Classical liberalism was the dominant set of economic ideas which set the stage for the concentration of wealth in the 1920s and eventually the Great Depression. Referred to now as neoliberalism, this economic ideology called for the dismantling of the post-war welfare state in the name of liberty and freedom from an intrusive government interfering with the so-called invisible hand of the market. In particular, this ideology proposed the lowering of taxes on the wealthy and corporate community, the deregulation of finance, and a dramatic shift in the economic priorities of the federal government. Rather than policies aimed towards securing a strong working and middle class through what might be termed the demand-side economics of the welfare state, essentially the redistribution of wealth downward, neoliberalism would implement a tax system geared more toward the needs of corporate America and the wealthy. This supply-side economics aimed toward redistributing wealth upward, where it would be invested by private enterprise rather than government into free markets. Theoretically, this upward redistribution would lead to wealth trickling down upon the working and middle classes, and theoretically it was promised to provide greater prosperity than the welfare state. Coming to fruition in the late 1970s and 1980s, the arrival of the neoliberal era fulfilled decades-old dreams of conservatives and neoliberal intellectuals who long struggled against the regulatory policies of the New Deal welfare state. The institutionalization of neoliberalism and supply-side economics of the 1980s through today provided the expected results: massive profits for large corporations and an ever-increasing concentration of wealth for the 1%. Since the late 1970s, however, there's been an ongoing decline in the standard of living for middle and working classes. In short, there was no trickle-down. Finally, we have this chart from almost 2 decades of research into wealth inequality by Saiz, Zuckman, along with Piketty, which illustrates the last 100 years of wealth distribution, with the pattern emphasizing what has been called the Great Compression. The authors write, quote, "The top 0.1% wealth share has risen from 7% in 1978 to 22% in 2012, a level almost as high as 1929. The bottom 90th wealth share first increased up to the mid-1980s and then has steadily declined." So how do we move from the wide distribution of income just a generation ago toward a situation worse than the year before the Great Depression? How are American voters persuaded to vote away the very political economic system which paved the way toward their middle class status? And after 40 years of promises from neoliberals and supply-side economists, what makes people who actually experienced the era of the welfare state continue to vote for a system which exponentially concentrates wealth toward the 1%, while their own income enters a 4th decade of stagnation? If you're rich, of course, it makes sense to keep the current system in place. I'll begin with a short conclusion and then work through the more detailed elements in the rest of the talk. In short, a conjunctural storm blew through the U.S. between the 1960s and 1980s, driving the shift from the welfare state to neoliberalism. The winds were driven by a number of intersecting world historical and national factors. The faltering of the welfare state amidst the Vietnam War and increased economic competition from particularly West Germany and Japan, the new rights culture war in reaction to social justice movements and the arrival of legislated social equality, the growth and political power of multinational conglomerates in the finance industry, the discrediting of Keynesian economists amid the onset of the late 1960s and 1970s economic crisis, and the rise of neoliberal economies. And finally, the turn away from economic populism, which supported the welfare state, toward populist conservatism. This conjunctural storm ushered in the origins of our contemporary era. To work through this story, we need to address the various routes leading down the road to inequality, moving from familiar avenues into less familiar back roads. First, we'll briefly explore the intricacies of the welfare state. Then we'll examine the rise of the new right and neoliberalism to challenge the tenets of the welfare state. Next, we'll explore how these challenges found voice in business literature. And finally, we'll explore the culture war and populist conservatism, which continues to drive much of our politics today. The welfare state was largely successful in creating a strong, growing white middle class and working class. It did so through the demand side of Keynesian-inspired Jim Crow welfare state, a social democratic framework where the federal government took control of economic priorities in the wake of the Great Depression and World War II. Through a tentative partnership with government and business and labor, the welfare state molded an economy based on the redistribution of income downward. The stress was on a strong consumer economy, getting income into the hands of regular folks, which would channel capital back through private enterprise. Because white nationalism still dominated American culture and economic circuits, the distribution of this income primarily went toward white men, including federally mandated redlining of non-white neighborhoods blocked from receiving federal subsidies. Thus, this post-war suburban utopia was founded on white male supremacy, which imagined white men occupying positions of power without competition from people of color or women as a product of nature. However, in the 1960s, the social world of race and gender relations was destabilized, upsetting these centuries-old hierarchies. In the face of these challenges came the reaction, the conservative culture war, which called on a renewal of, quote, tradition to fight off the gains of variously historically marginalized groups now deemed socially equal with white men through civil rights legislation. One of the many ironies of the post-1970s neoliberal era is the popular memory about the welfare state. While there is nostalgia for the happy days of the 1950s and early 1960s, there's an incredible loss of memory of the white nationalism of the period. One scholar characterized this era as, quote, affirmative action for whites, including federal programs facilitating a, quote, massive transfer of quite specific privileges to white Americans, end quote. Of course, the material memory of the era of spending power is what conjures warm thoughts for those living through this time when, as some say, America was great. One scholar notes this element influencing the popular memory of this era, quote, federal interventions did more than simply structure opportunity. Paradoxically, they also helped popularize the idea that government interventions were not providing considerable benefits to white people. Public officials, their private sector allies, and even federal appraisal guidelines assured whites that state interventions neither made suburban growth possible nor helped segregate the fast-growing metropolis by race. They promoted a story that urban and suburban outcomes resulted solely from impersonal market forces. Not surprisingly, white homeowners, particularly in the suburbs, embraced this narrative and made it a central refrain in local debates about housing, race, and inequality. This disavowal of institutional racism enabled countless white people to insist that their support for exclusion was not a racist act. Nonetheless, in this era of regulated capitalism, wealth trickled down to the white working and middle classes through this Jim Crow welfare state. Indeed, the pre-tax income of the bottom 60% of households more than doubled between 1949 and 1979, tracking neatly with rising productivity. In short, there is dramatic growth of real disposable income per American. While the 1950s saw about a 13% rise in real disposable income, between 1965 and 1972, this number increased on an average about 3% per year, or 24% over 7 years. Even teenagers felt this surge of income. Between 1944 and 1958, the teenagers' average weekly income quadrupled from $2.50 to $10. When regular people worked hard and produced, they were rewarded. Jefferson Cowie notes the outcome of these Keynesian economics, writing, as a result, more income, more equality, more optimism, more leisure, more consumer goods, more travel, more entertainment, more expansive homes, more education were all available in the post-war years to regular people than at any other time in world history. In the post-1970s era, this income-productivity connection splintered, leaving productivity to continue to rise at the expense of stagnating wages. The capital which previously trickled down towards labor's ongoing increase in productivity now trickled upwards towards corporate profits and the wealthy. With labor shelving its language of class while corporations negotiated and accepted government regulations, this economic system allowed many white Americans starting down the road of regulated, redistributed prosperity. American business also entered a golden age as they took advantage of the regulated markets shaping the 1950s economic boom. Taking hold during the crisis of the 1930s and the experience of World War II, the logic of controlled Keynesian capitalism resulted in a post-war consensus view that the large short-term capital flows of the 1920s and 1930s, as mediated through the financial system, had led to disaster. Capital movements under the welfare state were channeled through the official sector, rather than with banks and bond finance. And then the flows increasingly became privatized. This regulation sought to control and direct rather than succumb to unstable speculation. This federal direction of private investment separated the American welfare state from its European models. Writing in the early 1960s, Harold G. Vatter described this Keynesian feature of the post-war world, writing, "The guarantee of growth, which was evolving as a corollary policy of federal government during the 1950s, implied the conversion of mere intervention into participation. The commitment to guarantee both stability and growth in an economy in which private, profit-oriented business firms made the basic production decisions meant that the profitability of private business in the aggregate had to be guaranteed. Not just agricultural business, but large corporate business in general." Reined in by the regulations in the wake of the Depression, large corporations and finance increasingly chafed against the welfare state and its restraints by the 1960s. However, at the time of Vatter's writing in 1963, he noted the public's democratic desire to insist on, quote, "a wide dispersion in the control of the nation's tangible wealth as a requisite for the maintenance of a healthy private enterprise economy," end quote. In short, voters understood and embraced the American version of this socially democratic welfare state. A significant disruption to the welfare state came in the 1960s as the Civil Rights Movement and the 1964 Civil Rights Act laid bare the realities of the white nationalist Jim Crow welfare state. Suddenly, blacks were now legislatively equal with whites, and women were legislatively equal with men. Centuries of embedded hierarchies and the crimes policing these hierarchies suddenly found censure. Campus unrest, the anti-war movement, the ongoing civil rights movement further complicated this picture as these challenges undermined traditional white male authority. As a result, a white backlash against this disruption took hold in the mid-1960s. Although the Republican administration of Eisenhower governed for 2 terms, his time in office fell in line with the overall goals of the liberal consensus and the welfare state. Right. The welfare state was too popular to challenge head-on. However, after decades of marginalization, a revived conservative movement, or the New Right, found life through intellectuals such as William F. Buckley, Southern segregationist Democrats, and conservative Republicans. This new conservatism would both challenge the gains made by people of color and women in the 1960s and begin the process of prying away white voters from the welfare state. At the heart of American conservatism lay the preservation of traditional hierarchies. Apprentices and slaves subservient to masters, women subservient to men, blacks subservient to whites. In short, an ordered society where, as John Adams noted, quote, every man should know his place and be made to keep it, end quote. Adams immensely feared the destruction of, quote, all distinctions, end quote, that reinforced hierarchy. Conservative author Richard M. Weaver supported this sentiment in 1948, writing, "The most portentous general event of our time is the steady obliteration of those distinctions which create society. If society is something which can be understood, it must have structure. If it has structure, it must have hierarchy. Against this metaphysical truth, the declamations of the Jacobins break in vain. Equality is a disorganizing concept insofar as human relationships mean order. It is order without design. It attempts a meaningless and profitless regimentation of what has been ordered from time immemorial by the scheme of things." The social justice movements of the 1960s threw this conservative idealism into flux. And here it's where we see why this era becomes a pivot for the American political economy. The 1970s emerged as the first decade in the history of the U.S. when white men, especially white men with property, were legislatively forced to compete with women and people of color for economic and political opportunities for the very first time. This is an existential shock after centuries of white male entitlement. The representation of this shock most obviously emerged through 1970s Hollywood films, depicting lonely, rugged white men striking back at those marked as criminal and against civilization. From Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry to Charles Bronson's Death Wish to Robert De Niro's Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. This existential brooding of white men's loss of rights and entitlements via social equality legislation provided a critical opening for conservatives to dismantle the interventionist welfare state. Historiography calls this period the Southernization of the U.S. The sudden reality of treating people of color and women as equals after centuries of white male heteronormative supremacy stirred the deep impulses, the traditions of American society. Federal intervention was supported by white American men when it was exclusively aimed toward their needs and excluded people of color and women from being primary recipients. However, when federal intervention on behalf of the civil rights movement overruled the historic rights of white men to control the politics and economics of the U.S., suddenly, working and white middle-class men found common cause with the anti-big government arguments of neoliberal economists, conservatives, and big business. Across the 1950s and 1960s, neoliberal ideas coalesced with the new right in the conservative culture war, bringing an intellectual economic argument into dialogue with conservatism's traditional defense of the wealthy. The 1960s cultural nightmare of racial and gendered equality opened the GOP's arms to those anxious over extending equal rights towards those previously deemed second-class citizens. In particular, two of neoliberalism's defining elements, privatization and colorblindness, found common cause with the political language of resistance against social equality. Public facilities would be privatized to thwart federally sanctioned segregation, while these policies of access found justification through the language of rights of property. Meanwhile, colorblind language espousing analytical measurements would institutionally limit access, leaving question of who gets to measure and define up to those already controlling these institutions. In addition, the new language of resistance toward federal intervention found affiliation with a corporate world bristling under what they perceived to be their own struggle against business regulations. Neoliberal language would pull together those suspicious of government intervention into their lives and economy, from disgruntled whites to conservative Republicans to big business. Traditional histories of neoliberalism examine its evolution after the 1930s and 40s as a transnational political philosophy and system of economic, political, and cultural relations. An American variant of neoliberalism emerged after a period of institutional consolidation in the 1950s and 60s, primarily through the work of scholars at the Chicago School of Economics, Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman. As a successor to the classical liberal ideas from the late 19th and early 20th century, the dominant theoretical premise of neoliberalism rests on a fundamentally free market unfettered by government intrusion, including a combination of deregulation and privatization justified in the name of competition and the elimination of government bureaucracy. Far from elimination of government, however, neoliberalism in practice has merely redirected the state's prerogatives away from the public welfare of Keynesianism toward a state working on behalf of private capital. Ignoring capital concentration and its arguments for competition, neoliberalism sought the free flow of capital, the freeing of markets from democratic interference, and the assertion that the market is better able to produce information and services than the state. Finally, these economic programs were imagined as, quote, moral codes, grounded in the notion that pronounced inequality of economic resources and political rights were a necessary functional characteristic of their ideal market system. Accordingly, neoliberalism offered conservatism a reimagined place for the reinstitutionalization of hierarchical distinctions in society. The cultural economic characteristics of the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s included two often antagonistic ideas: formal equality and complete faith in the marketplace. This blend of colorblind formal equality, absent the historical legacies of racism and sexism, and the rights of property, aided the culture war's aim of deflecting race and gender-based criticisms of society and business. In particular, they reconfigured racial antagonism toward blacks and other people of color by censuring vulgar or overtly racist language and replacing it with the language of reform built around market guidelines, analytical measurements, or simply the rule of law. Thus, the old language of racism could now hide behind colorblind pronouncements and coded racism. For example, welfare as code for handouts to people of color. Through this prism, inequality could be framed through the workings of a market or quantitative analysis, as ostensibly race and gender-neutral arena of commerce. Overt racial bias could be replaced by the language of lack of skills without any reference to the institutional racism and sexism policing the access to acquiring skills. This emerging colorblind framework celebrated an abstract equality of access to theoretically free markets, while the invisible hand of whiteness found concealment behind the abstraction of ostensibly impartial markets. The material outcomes accumulated through the decades and centuries of virtually white male access to the opportunities of economic prosperity simply disappeared from debate when measuring how exactly markets would reform their logics, whose origins lay within a racialized and gendered American capitalism. Neoliberal ideas assume that all gains for white Americans in the post-war years were cultivated through a ruggedly individual work ethic and not a system of a white nationalist welfare state. Thus, it could be argued that white homeowners after World War II simply made a market choice to live and work in the suburbs, while black people did not. Racist federal and state policies, let alone white terrorism towards blacks, had no hand in the matter. While conservatives courted the white side of the majority vote in the late 1960s and 1970s, space began opening in economic discourse to allow neoliberal ideas to challenge the Keynesianism of the welfare state. One reflection of this shift came from the weekly business news magazines. In early October of 1974, Business Week magazine issued a special report describing the U.S. as, quote, the debt economy without peer. The authors broke down what they called a mountain of debt, 2.5 trillion high, 1 trillion in corporate debt, 600 billion in mortgage debt, 500 billion in U.S. government debt, 200 billion in state and local government debt, and 200 billion in consumer debt. According to the news magazine, perpetual borrowing, based upon the assumption of ongoing post-war growth, finally stumbled in the late 1960s, crashing amidst rising inflation, foreign competition, an expensive war, and the oil crisis beginning in 1973. With a recession emerging in the wake of skyrocketing oil prices, the Federal Reserve adopted measures to squeeze credit in an attempt to counter inflation. Post-war growth ground to a halt while inflation sliced into earnings. The debate over an exit route from this economic pileup centered on what alternative path to take, with the welfare state becoming the prime target. In the commentary section of this dead economy issue of Business Week, John Carson Parker prophesized the economic direction embraced by conservative politicians in the late 1970s and 1980s as the post-war neoliberal ideas displaced Keynesianism. He writes, "Some people will obviously have to do with less or with substitutes so that the economy as a whole can get the most mileage out of available capital. There will be fewer homes and more apartment houses built. It will be harder to launch risky new ventures because the needs of existing business will be so great. Indeed, cities and states, the home mortgage market, small business, and the consumer will all get less than they want because the basic health of the U.S. is based on the basic health of its corporations and banks, the biggest borrowers and the biggest lenders. Compromises in terms of who gets what, or who gets and who does without, that would have been unthinkable only a few years ago, will be made in coming years because the economic future not only of the U.S. but also the whole world is on the line today." As multinationals and banks went into debt through their borrowing, often for acquisitions expanding the size of conglomerates, the author of the commentary argued that Americans must give in to the prerogatives of big business. Considering how much depended on giant conglomerates, without healthy corporations, Carson Parker warned, everything from cities to nations to world economies would collapse. They were too big to fail. Carson Parker acknowledged this choice of austerity in exchange for supporting multinationals would be a, quote, hard pill for many Americans to swallow. The idea of doing with less so that big business can have more. Quote, especially since they, big business, are also in large measure the cause of this crisis. Selling this idea to make people accept the new reality would be difficult, but needed in order to regain the profit margins of the post-war years. For Carson Parker, a national economic program needed to support the requirements of multinational conglomerates in the finance industry directing capital around the globe. The culture war, of course, would help sell this idea, quote, to make people accept the new reality, aiding the shift from the era of the welfare state into the era of neoliberalism. An increasing number of commentaries in Business Week adopted the tenets of the culture war, framing the redistributionist ideas of Keynesianism as socialist threats. One such case was published without a byline in a December 1975 issue entitled Egalitarianism, Threat to a Free Market. Criticizing the federal government's expansion and programs meant to level goods and powers in the American society, the author condemned this redistribution of income and wealth, asserting, quote, the classic principle that what a man consumes must be determined by what he produces or what he owns. Right? The egalitarian movement is essentially authoritarian. It is highly critical of business and contemptuous of laissez-faire economics, end quote. According to the author, the major differences from the 1970s and the early New Deal was that the latter accepted inequality and justified welfare programs as humanitarian, whereas in the 70s, aid to the poor is seen as, quote, a matter of right, end quote. Again, in the culture war, linking welfare to civil rights gains while conveniently ignoring the decades of whites-only access to welfare state policies. His adherence to the conservative culture war found voice in his listing of the primary culprits demanding income redistribution. Quote, the blacks and other minorities, and lately from the women's movement. The demand for equal job opportunities and equal pay for equal work has paved the way for the assertion of a right to equal housing, education, and enjoyment of life, end quote. Without irony, the blame was placed on the very groups only recently given social equality with white men. The white majority's voting power, previously adhering to supporting the Jim Crow welfare state, increasingly gravitated towards conservative voices criticizing the demands of civil rights activists as the 1970s unfolded amidst a crushing recession. Increasingly, previous supporters of the welfare state now saw Democrats as doing too much for African Americans at the expense of white people. Using the culture war, conservatives framed themselves as grassroots protectors of white communities and families innocently being attacked by, quote, big government for achieving the American dream. A critical element towards undermining the welfare state now opened to people of color and women was defunding big government. The Revenue Act of 1978 helped bring the dream of neoliberalism closer to reality. Poll readings noted, quote, dissatisfaction reached a level in 1978 which, if not the historic high, lay fair claim to being the highest since survey data first became available, end quote. At least 55% of respondents to one poll indicated that the tax system was unfair. While there was low trust in government, especially after the political scandals of the 1970s, as well as negative views on welfare spending by 1978, most Americans continue to want, quote, big government if the latter means a high level of government-provided services. Thus, while conservatives were successful in placing the image of the welfare state in the minds of Americans as government handouts to the undeserved poor, most often imagined as people of color, for most, the actual workings of the welfare state enjoyed by Americans appeared to be something they were not ready to relinquish to the free market utopia of neoliberalism. The Revenue Act proceeded to slash the tax on capital gains from 49% to 28%, with one commentator calling the legislation the Millionaires' Relief Act of 1978. With the Revenue Act signed into law by Carter, the Democratic president effectively shifted the income distribution upward through the lowering of taxes on wealthy and corporations, while the tax burden shifted downward on working and middle classes. This act became ground zero for the era of neoliberalism. Meanwhile, as Judith Stein notes, as benefits flowed toward businessmen and the wealthy, there were, quote, no guarantees that they would invest it in the United States. After a decade of contraction, benign neglect, and Reagan's institutionalization of neoliberal logic via Reaganomics, business steadily recovered from the 1970s at the expense of workers. The swing to the right in terms of economics also pulled the Democratic Party closer to the values of neoliberals. In 1983, Business Week outlined this new crop of, quote, neoliberals, end quote, defined without reference to the actual neoliberal movement. They write, quote, neoliberals were framed as young Democrat politicians who want to stop relying on government to redistribute income and assure equality of opportunity. Instead, the neoliberal focuses on market mechanisms, high technology, international competitiveness, and economic growth to achieve these ends, end quote. In short, rather than the economic security of the New Deal welfare state, the neoliberal Democrat adopted the quantitative analysis of conservative neoliberal market logic. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama would represent this brand of neoliberalism within the Democratic Party, while neoliberal and supply-side economics were welded into the Republican Party's DNA with Reagan. To sell this redistribution of wealth, a final element entered the conjunctural equation, populist conservatism. To bolster its traditionally wealthy constituents, the GOP desperately needed the populist authenticity of regular white working and middle-class voters from the South and the West. Since the 1960s and 1970s, the conservative culture war provided the path towards securing this populism. James Davison Hunter defines the post-1960s culture war as rooted in, quote, the competition to define social reality, quote, resulting from the history of America's uneasy pluralism. The 1960s culture war sought to challenge the new structures of social equality, with conservatives seeking to, quote, retain their advantage in defining the habits and meaning of American culture, end quote. Of course, these deep traditions of meaning were routed through decades of white supremacy, slavery and Jim Crow, patriarchy, and xenophobic settler colonialism. Winning the culture war meant controlling the language and knowledge, defining cultural and economic reality. For a brief moment in the 1960s, this control had escaped the grasp of, quote, tradition, as women and people of color gained legislative social equality with white men. A perfect storm brewed across the 1970s, however, as the culture war stirred together populist angst towards the welfare state with the ideas of neoliberalism. One of the most powerful attributes of neoliberalism rests in its ability to support the needs of big business and finance, while simultaneously casting a reformist image of capitalist society using the populist language of small-scale, small business community relationships. In this economic equation, capital concentration either does not exist or is conveniently ignored when discussing competition. Instead, big government intervention is the culprit. Thus, this neoliberal vision of society intersected with the more traditional idea of populist conservatism, imagining, quote, the small guy seeking liberty against the tyranny of big government intervention, cementing the moral code of neoliberalism as an economics for ordinary people. Accordingly, if the welfare state thrived through an economic populism mobilized by FDR and New Deal Democrats and liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans, Southern segregationists rallied around the idea of populist conservatism, right? A form of American populism stressing xenophobia, anti-blackness, patriarchy, and a suspicion towards government intervention, which business and finance desperately wanted. This government intervention, of course, is acceptable if it comes in the form of defense contracts and bases. The conservative culture war was essential for creating a populist rhetoric convincing those who benefited most from the welfare state to support a political program dismantling the structure of government responsible for shaping the white middle class in the 1950s and 60s. Carson's, quote, hard pill to swallow, moreover, exchanged intervention on behalf of working and middle class citizens for a new policy aimed toward supporting the needs of multinationals financing the wealthy. In return for their allegiance to a conservative economic program, white Americans were treated to the colorblind coded language of the new right. In a 1981 off-the-record comment, GOP campaign manager Lee Atwater was recorded explaining how the culture war worked for the Republican Southern strategy. He says, "You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word." These dog whistle politics built on the conservative culture war helped justify dismantling the welfare state. This political racial coding figured prominently across the neoliberal era up through today. In 1984, Atwater further outlined the balancing act between dog whistle politics and the courting of the populist vote for conservative economic policies, asserting, "Populists have always been liberal on economics, so long as the crucial issues were generally confined to economics, as during the New Deal, the liberal candidate would get most of the populist vote. But populists are conservative on most social issues. As for race, it was hardly an issue. It went without saying that populist chosen leaders were hardcore segregationists. When social and cultural issues died down, populists were left with no compelling reason to vote Republican. When Republicans are successful in getting certain social issues to the forefront, the populist vote is ours." Fortunately for Atwater, Reagan, and the GOP, the economic populism supporting the New Deal appeared to drown during the baptism of neoliberal Reaganomics in the 1980s. For the white working and middle classes, however, the choice of populist conservatism led to a struggle through a cold winter in America as wealth inequality unfolded into the highest gaps in the 20th century. By 1989, the poverty level had reached 32 million Americans, with rates distributed through the deep patterns established via centuries-old racial hierarchies. 10% for whites, 26% for Latinos, and 31% for African Americans. Conservative author Kevin Phillips, one of the architects for Nixon's Southern strategy, specifically noted the outcomes of these policies on white working and middle-class men at the end of the 1980s, asserting, "White males serving as their family's only breadwinner were, as a category, particularly conspicuous. By one calculation, their median inflation-adjusted income fell 22% between 1976 and 1984. After the 1983 recovery, many squeezed or depressed households discovered that their economic problems weren't simply recession hangovers. As domestic and global economic restructuring continued, well-paid manufacturing jobs and the purchasing power of manufacturing paychecks shrank. For all workers, white collar as well as blue collar, their real average weekly wage, calculated in constant 1977 dollars, fell from 191 a week in 1972 to 171 in 1986. The era of neoliberalism opened the doors to policies resulting in the richest 5% of households obtaining roughly 82% of all the nation's gains in wealth between 1983 and 2009. The bottom 60% of households actually had less wealth in 2009 than in 1983. The New York Times opinion piece, Our Broken Economy in One Simple Chart by David Leonhardt, written on the eve of the 2017 Trump administration tax bill, shows the outcome of this decades-old era of neoliberalism. As Leonhardt notes, this wasn't inevitable. There was a time before when the middle class and the poor weren't just receiving healthy raises. Their take-home pay was rising even more rapidly in percentage terms than the pay of the rich, end quote. Only the politics changed, formed through the conjuncture of the old ghosts of race, gender, and sexuality haunting populist conservatism, a rejuvenated new right fused together with old segregationist Democrats, now Republicans, and neoliberal economists finding the opportune time of crisis to implement their policies, and the sheer momentum of the engines of global capitalism, multinational conglomerates, and finance. This conjuncture formed into a powerful storm, a winter in America, battering the democratically supported welfare state and setting us on the course toward wealth and income inequality. Thank you.
Kind of a technical question. You mentioned the 1978 Revenue Act, but in '73 we see the split starting to happen. What kind of policies were enacted around that time?
It's the recession.
Okay.
So I think there's a recession kicks in. Again, this is like it's why it's so hard to talk about. Like, you have like this corporate evolution, right? You have these merger movements, and so that's affecting things.
So this kind of came together.
Yeah, and then the moment the oil crisis hits, if you're wealthy,
Right.
it doesn't hit you as bad. If you're working class, middle class, suddenly, I mean, what it went up like quadrupled, went from $0.25 to $1 or something like that.
Yeah.
That's insane, right? It'd be, what is it? I mean, it's $2 here. Where I used to live, it was $4.50 for a gallon of gas. Right, like if that quadrupled, like $16 a gallon. So a bunch of stuff's happening. So I think there's necessarily that. I mean, that's why the best word I use is conjuncture. Right? There's no broad conspiracy. There's a conspiracy of wanting certain politics.
Right.
But it all comes together in a perfect storm of, you know, the Vietnam War, the welfare state, spending, the civil rights movement. Like, again, you can't discount that the 1970s is the first decade that white men, especially white men with property, have to compete with everyone else for political and economic opportunities. Like, that's after 400 years of absolute monopoly on power. And so that throws a wrench into things, even if it's not overt, right? The way that you frame things. But.
Okay, thanks.
I just want to follow up. I agree absolutely with your explanation, Dan. There's no single factor. There's a huge conjuncture. 72 comes the opening to China. 73 comes the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system and international trade. Those are crucial moments of the evacuation of the power of the American working class over wages that then plays out over the subsequent 15 years. And it was all during the Carter administration when in many cases, the power of the railway unions, the steelworkers unions, airline unions all started to be disentangled and dismantled.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's bipartisan. Like, Carter opens the door to, I mean, Paul Volcker becomes the Fed. Like, he's another lever, right? The deregulation begins under Carter. And again, I mean, I always tell students this when we talk about like early capitalism, British East India Company, nobody knows what they're doing, right? You imagine like, okay, we're going to do transnational capitalism and we're from Europe. How do we do that? I don't know. We just kind of, British East India Company just figures out how to do it. So
We
when
never
this,
had.
and then when this
Floating
happens in
exchange
the
rates.
70s,
It was a new invention.
when this happens in the 70s, you know, it's sort of that, I mean, there's a famous, I didn't put it in here, there's a famous Milton Friedman quote that he says something like along the lines of what intellectuals are supposed to do are keep ideas alive until there's an opportune crisis. And then at that moment, you bring the ideas in. And in this case, neoliberalism connected with the needs of multinationals in finance, the needs of white people that don't want government intervention into desegregation, right? Because a lot of this comes from white suburbs in the north that are completely white through federal policy, and they just don't have signs out. They didn't need the signs. They had federal policies in place. So it's kind of, all this stuff just kind of comes together at once.
Dan, so what are the implications of your story for the current electoral narrative? Where are we going? Is it revolution? Is it results? Is it a plan?
I always think of the 2016 election, and I started writing this like 2009, and I finished my dissertation, and I didn't really know what I did. I had to teach and go back to the dissertation to figure out what I did, but then we're going through that era of the Tea Party, right? And you had that famous sign, "Get your government hands off my Medicare." Right? And so then just kind of like, wow, like there's a huge memory gap in this older baby boom white population that grew up as close to socialism the nation had ever come in the 50s. Right? And what they remember is the warmth of the spending power and security. You could argue too that they remember the white men supremacy too. But for most across the broad spectrum, there's this kind of warmth of, we were kind of in control. Well, you were in control because the economy was it was a social democracy, right? It was a welfare state. And so that 2016 election, it just depended where you sat on this divide. If you have historically been suspicious towards social equality, towards people of color, women, LGBTQ, you're going to vote with the guy that does not like gay people. It calls Mexicans rapists and murderers. And then he kind of throws out his language. Remember that one time he said, "Oh, I'm going to take a hit with my taxes." Or there's that brief, like one speech he said that, and everyone's like, whoa, maybe this is the guy. So on the one hand, you have white people that aren't doing well, right? They're in that bottom part, but they find warmth in those arguments of populist conservatism, right? The racism, the sexism, right? Grab them by the you know what, like that's warming because it's a return to a white male domination with unfettered consequences. So for some people voted for Trump. Other people, and this is why, like remember, it's supposed to really be between Bush and Clinton. Like the alternative reality would have been, that was their time, right? Either Bush was supposed to be elected or Clinton was supposed to be elected, and then the American story would continue with these two, it'd be the Skywalkers, right? Right. But it's not that. It was an anti-institution. So Bernie Sanders comes in from the left, and he's gathering up that, but he's actually speaking this language. He's talking about wealth inequality. And so you kind of have these two demographics. They have cultural, political differences, but I'd say their sentiments, or the structures of feeling, right? They both connect because they both know that something's wrong. They just don't know what it is. For some, it's capital concentration. For others, it's the rapists and murderers, right? And LGBTQ, gay marriage, right? It just depends on the sorts of ideas that you come. So I'd say now, Bernie Sanders is doing well, right? Like, if you look at the fighting between Democrats, Joe Biden's sort of that establishment. He likes neoliberalism, like he is a neoliberal, right? The Democratic Party is wanting a neoliberal in there. So I don't know. My fear is the populist conservatism. I grew up with too many people that had guns and they're pissed, right? And it's just like, I don't know, what are you going to do when your guy doesn't get reelected for whatever reason? I don't know. Hopefully it's just paranoia, but that to me is the scary outcome, right? I think that guy that came on, he's training his 5-year-old in case Sanders gets elected to shoot an AR-15.
Yeah.
Right. Did you?
So with Bernie Sanders on the scene, we're starting to see cracks in the neoliberalism.
Yeah, I would
I
say.
would assume that,
Well, and then right after that crash, you had all these people like Paul Volcker came out and said I was wrong. And there a couple of neoliberals kind of came out and said that, like, yeah, our policies are wrong. And then some of those, the Kevin Phillips, does anyone know Kevin Phillips? Like Kevin Phillips, he was the architect of the Southern strategy. By the end of the 80s, he's just like, Reaganomics, this is not conservatism. In his head. This is just like a scramble for the rich, right? And he kind of splits with that, with those ideas. So he's just, I would say he's an early canary in the coal mine.
Dan? Well, I want to see if there were any students who still had ideas or something like that. Dan, we agree on a million things. We've already talked a little bit about capitalism. I really like the whole structure that you put here. I think there are a lot of things that we could all talk about, like the Great Migration, like the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system, like the nature of the welfare state as an essentially white nationalist risk mitigation scheme that would all fit here nicely. I'd like to hear a little bit more, however, about what I perceived as a certain tendency in your talk to associate Keynesianism with social democracy and neoliberalism with conservatism. And the concept I'm going to throw out is weaponized Keynesianism.
Yeah.
We currently exist in a 6% deficit regime. This is almost unheard of. Right? We live in a Keynesian governmental economy.
Yeah.
And we always have, and Nixon was right. We're all Keynesians now. I was studying economics in the late 80s with neo-Keynesians, self-described neo-Keynesians, one of them being Greg Mankiw, who went on to become George W. Bush's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. No one ever said Keynesianism stopped.
Yeah.
What got layered on top of it is this collapse of a fantasized, quasi-conservative, re-racialized, essentially re-racialized neoconservatism. That's sort of my assertion. Does that kind of follow what you see? Or
Yeah, again, it's like, like this was like 48 pages.
And your book explains it.
Yeah.
I can't wait to read it.
So, yeah, I mean, World War II is the big, that's the test.
15, 16,
World War II
17%
is,
spending.
that gets, like, the New Deal doesn't get rid of the Depression, World War II does. And then the secret was the Cold War can justify World War II. But then the Cold War can also justify a welfare state, right? So it can justify redistribution towards the bottom part. A critical component of that is the military spending. And that's the secret sauce. Like, that's the whole, like, Reagan wants to cut all this stuff, but he's going to up the ante and the economy's going down. He'll up the spending on defense, and it'll be the Keynesian stimulus, but he can hide behind patriotism. So the same way that FDR and the New Deal people could hide behind patriotism to have a welfare state, Reagan could hide behind patriotism for this military-industrial complex and the Keynesian that. And that's that whole, like, I don't want government interference, but I'll take that base, right? Or I'll take these government contracts, or what was it, that bomber that was made in like 49 states? Or something like that, like parts were made in every single state to divvy out sort of the benefits. So, yeah, no, it's Keynesianism for the rich, because I don't have any shares in weapons stocks. That would probably be something smart to invest in.
If you've got TIAA-CREF funds that are general funds, you got Boeing.
Yeah, so we got a little bit. We get a little bit of that. So, but yeah, I think it's slippery. Everything's slippery. And Keynesianism is, it's always a Keynesian-inspired.
And the Swedes,
It's
the Germans,
Keynesian-inspired
and the French are the other
welfare
arms
state.
producers.
What's that?
The Swedes, the Germans, and the French are the other weapons producers,
Yeah.
along with the Russians and the Chinese, who are a different kind of neoliberal
Yeah.
socialist welfare state. So, complicated. Thank you.
All right. got a goatee.